We are gathered on the day of the Lord. Let's say that prayer that we all know and begin with our Lord's Prayer. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. I am here as chair, obviously pastor of St. Anthony's, and a chair of the Diocesan Year of Jubilee of Mercy Committee. This is our third session. The first session was about why Ecumenical Council, why Vatican Council II. It was held at Holy Name Church, and the speaker, Agnes Druzy, who is a professor and a writer and a historian, gave a beautiful outline why there was need of Vatican II Council. I'm glad I was there. I learned a few things that I didn't know myself. That session was never videotaped, but there's going to be a repeat session in Medicine Hat for that area, so there's an opportunity to videotape that one. After the first session was done, Bishop Henry said, I wish we didn't videotape it. So the second one, which was in Vietnamese church, beautiful new church, the proud host of that session, they have videotaped it, and eventually it will be online at the Diocesan website. Now we have Bandy, who is a member. Are you a member of our parish? Yes, you are. Yeah. He works at two other churches, that's why I'm asking that. Yeah, but his faithfulness is here. And so he will be videotaping, and I'm glad I asked him. I'm sorry I didn't ask him before, but all of a sudden, oh yes, I have somebody here who can do that. So he's going to videotape all the rest of the sessions. There are 8 sessions, so whatever is left here, so that there's a uniformity how it is done also, one person handling all this. So today we have the third session, and then don't forget, this is at the back of one of our carry-ons 3 months ago. So make a copy of it, and the next session is a speaker coming from, I believe, United States, Father Michael Magoti, and he will be at St. Luke's Parish, May 15th, Sunday, May 15th. So today we have our third session, Gaudium Spes, and the Great Commission, and Sara. When I read about Sara, name Bishop Henry suggested, I thought it was a tall woman, and I'm glad I can say eye to eye with you. Yeah, Sara is the regional coordinator for Western Canada for the Canadian Catholic Organization for Development and Peace. We heard about development and peace, appeal in Lantern and all that. Also known as Caritas Canada. She is responsible for coordinating the in-Canada programs, education, advocacy, and fundraising for the province of Alberta, British Columbia, Northwest Territories, and the Yukon. Sara also supports development and peace Catholic school program, engaging Catholic school community in practicing their faith, learning about Catholic social teaching, and engaging in charitable actions in international solidarity and social justice. Now, she has been with Development Peace for a little under 6 years. She is Egyptian born, moved with her family to Canada in 1995. She got engaged in the social justice at Catholic High School in Edmonton. Actually, she drove from Edmonton to be with us. She went on to the University of Alberta, graduated with honors degree in history and certificate in Middle Eastern African studies. She then obtained a master's in international affairs specialized in conflict analysis and resolution from the normal Patterson School of International Affairs in Canada. She worked for several years for the federal government in Ottawa at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade, as well as the Department of National Defense. She then joined United Nations World Food Program in Rome before joining Development Peace in 2010. She also worked with local civil society organizations in Bolivia and in Cuba. To development and peace, she has spent time with community in Madagascar, Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, and most recently the Philippines. This experience has enabled her to appreciate, witness, and speak to the diocese lead by some of the most vulnerable marginalized communities in those countries. It's a great pleasure to share those voices with people here in Canada and to witness the work of the global church in serving and advocating for the most poor and vulnerable in our family. I welcome her assistant, and welcome you all to participate and share in these sessions. Just the first part will be about 45-50 to an hour. Following that, we'll have a little break, washroom break, the coffee, juice. Following the second part, which will be answer questions, if you have any questions, then we go to the church for Sunday evening prayer too. Sara.
This works with me. Thank you all for being here today. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here. And to follow Dr. Dudrisi and Dr. Valtutis, I'm actually very humbled. Thanks also to Bishop Henry, who had contacted me about this, and Father Jack for the wonderful introduction, and for the beautiful parish, for hosting us in this beautiful parish. And for the ladies, actually, who, as you will know, the most important thing is food for our bodies. So thanks to the ladies at the back, so I want to honor them. And of course to Kathleen, who's my colleague, who actually drove from Edmonton. And she's the Catholic Schools Program Officer, so I wanted to note that. So anything we do in the Catholic schools is actually her. I can't take credit for that, so that's just a correction. Okay, as we move on. The agenda for today, hopefully in the next hour or so, we'll talk about the relationships between the Year of Mercy, Gaudium et Spes, and the Canadian Church in context. In this section, I'll hopefully present enough information to show the relationships between them and their significance for each other. Next, we'll talk about Caritas. So, of course, when somebody tells you you have 45 minutes to an hour to talk about Gaudium et Spes, in the context of Vatican II, Year of Mercy, and then the work of Caritas, I was like, are you kidding me? This is a bit daunting, but actually one thing that links them all very nicely is Caritas. The concept, love received and given. It's clear from the documents that the concept of God's love is fundamental to understanding the meaning and vocation of the human person, their role in relationship to communities, and their role in the work of the church. And essentially what I'll talk about is the church's work is the work of Caritas, of receiving and responding to God's love. And then, of course, as well as Caritas, the organization Caritas, which was actually created in Canada, as the founding bishops call it, in the cradle of Vatican II. So first we'll do a textual analysis of Gaudium et Spes and the Bull of Indiction, and see what they say about God's love. And in that same section, in section 2, we'll talk about some of the teachings of the church. So now the principles of the Catholic Church, and depending on which conference of bishops, there are 7 or 10, they take this tradition of the teaching and they give us sort of operational guidelines for our work. And then thirdly, we'll see how these teachings are applied, and I'll share some of the, like I said, as my introduction said, my pleasure is to share the voice of the communities that are in our human family that don't have the opportunity to have their voices heard. So I will use these examples to show how this practice of Caritas is applied. And so thirdly, we'll talk about Caritas Canada Development and Peace. So we'll sort of reverse it. Here's the organization and how it works, and how is almost every single thing, from how we choose our partners to how we work in Canada, is actually finds its authority from the Church's teaching in Gaudium et Spes. So the objectives are to first learn about Gaudium et Spes, so its significance, structure, main points, become familiar with the text, and this is why I gave you a handout with a number of the quotes that are compelling and related to Caritas. Learn about the Church's teaching on Caritas, and finally learn how these teachings are applied and practiced. So there are a number of quotes in the presentation. Sorry, I just got louder, that's why I'm looking a bit frazzled. Where there is emphasis, it is mine. It's because I want to highlight a particular point. And in the PowerPoint, you'll find sometimes there's an asterisk. Some of you have been asked to read some quotes out loud, so at least if you haven't read the document, you will have read the one quote from the document. Finally, there are a number of slides, 3 or 4 slides in the PowerPoint with a bird, and it's a filled-in purple bird. And these moments will just take 1 or 2 minutes to just reflect on whether it's the scripture or the text. It'll also give me a chance to regroup here. So, functional and spiritual purpose, I hope. So, onward we go. Year of Mercy. So, the main document for the Year of Mercy is the Bull of Indiction, Misericordia Vultus, by Pope Francis, and the Year of Mercy was declared on December 8, 2015, which is the Solemnity of the Immaculate Conception, to November 20th, 2016, which is the Solemnity of Christ the King. So why December 8th? That's a question. Vatican II. So there is in the text, and actually Pope Francis says it quite explicitly, I have chosen the date of 8th of December because of its rich meaning in the recent history of the Church. I will open the Holy Door on the 50th anniversary of the closing of the Second Ecumenical Vatican Council. The Church feels a great need to keep this event alive. And so, why does Pope Francis interpret this as a great event in the history of the Church? What is it about it? So what he says about Vatican II, again in the Bull of Indiction, the Church Fathers strongly perceived a need to talk about God in a more accessible way, to proclaim the gospel in a new way, a new phase of the same evangelization, so it's not a total departure. Bear witness to their faith with greater enthusiasm and conviction. And then the Church sensed the responsibility to be a living sign of the Father's love in the world. And hold on to that. And this is our point of departure, to be a living sign of the Father's love in the world. So, Vatican II. And you talked about it at length with Dr. Didris. Actually, how many people here attended the first 2 sessions? Let's just, or 1 or 2 sessions. Okay, good. So, quite a few people. So some of this stuff I wasn't able to attend in person, but I got their presentation, so hopefully I'm not being redundant. So Dr. Didris had this wonderful graphic in her presentation where she had the 4 pillars of the 4 main documents, the 4 constitutions, and one of them is Gaudium et Spes, which is the pastoral constitution of the Church in the modern world, promulgated by Pope Paul VI on December 7, 1965. So, and this is what we will focus on today. So one of the 4 constitutions. So some general information. One of 4 constitutions, 16 documents. And actually, it wasn't part of the original schema. So there was no preparatory draft. It was actually suggested in the first session, sort of from the floor, by a Belgian bishop, that this is an issue that's of sufficient importance that it needed to be addressed in the Second Vatican Council. It was also approved at the last session, December 7, 1965, and the vote is 2,307 to 75. There's a clear influence of the participation and contribution of bishops around the world, or the global south, right? So not North America, what we consider the West or the North. And Dr. Bartolus had a wonderful sort of breakdown of the percentages, right? Just a little over 50% represented the majority world. And it builds on and affirms, and this is important, earlier Catholic social teaching. So you see the first encyclical in Catholic social teaching is Rerum Novarum, on the condition of labor, by Pope Leo XIII. But then there was Quadragesimo Anno, Pacem in Terris. So there are a number of encyclicals, social encyclicals, that sort of looked at the signs of the times and responded to them. At the same time, it marks a new stage in Catholic social teaching. So some of the main points here are, Gaudium et Spes talked about the Church in the world, reaching out to the world, rather than here's the church and here's the world, and they don't always see eye to eye and sometimes regard each other with suspicion. But this talked about the church being in the world. In the text, it says there was a responsibility to read the signs of the times and interpret them in the light of the gospel. And all these quotes, as you see, are in your package. So there was a concern for an appeal to the whole of humanity. And there was obviously a particular concern for the poor. In fact, the first line in Gaudium et Spes, so Gaudium et Spes is the joys and the hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the men of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. And lastly, justice is integral to the church's mission. So now we talk about the social mission of the church as being that of charity and that of justice. And Gaudium et Spes was one of those documents that made that especially clear. There was no compromise on this. This was integral to the life of the church and to the mission of the church. Essentially, if you could sum up the objective of Gaudium et Spes, well, it sums it up itself, I don't have to do it. The council wishes to speak to all men in order to shed light on the mystery of man. So there's an element of this comes back to us, it's not just us doing for out there, and to cooperate in finding the solution to the outstanding problems of our time. And we're not going to go through, as you'll see, the whole document, but it's astounding to see how common these problems are and how we still address some of these problems. Whether it's globalization, migrant workers, refugees, all of these are actually addressed very practically in the document. So you'll see, so the first page of the handout refers to the structure. So there's a preface and introductory statements. Part 1, the church and man's calling. So this is sort of the general thesis, the general argument of Gaudium et Spes. And today we're going to particularly look at chapters 1, 2, and 4. So the dignity of the human person, the community of mankind, and the role of the church in the modern world. And then the second section is some problems of special urgency. So this is where you find the topical stuff. But again, I really do urge you to read it. It was a fascinating read because a lot of the problems remain the same. And one other section we're going to focus on almost immediately is the promotion of a community of nations. So one of the most practical things that came out of the document, or practical recommendations of Gaudium et Spes and the Council Fathers, was in the setting up of an international community. So the Council, considering the immensity of the hardships which still afflict the greater part of mankind today, regards it as most opportune that an organism of the universal church be set up, in order that the justice and love of Christ, again, focus on the justice and love of Christ, toward the poor might be developed everywhere. An outstanding form of international activity on the part of Christians is found in the joint efforts, both as individuals and in groups, they contribute to institutes already established. So we're going to focus on a number of elements here in this particular quote. Already established. So what was already established at the time? Caritas was already established at the time. What we now know as the official Vatican Agency for International Development, Caritas Internationalis, had already started in Germany as Caritas Germany in 1897. By 1951, 13 Caritas members meet in Europe, inspired by the vision of the future Pope Paul VI, who becomes instrumental actually to the Caritas organization. And they establish Caritas Internationalis. And it becomes then, as it is now, the Church's official voice in relation to its teachings in the area of charity. By Vatican II, there are 74 member organizations, so you can tell that's already a great move. Pope Paul VI himself becomes instrumental in founding certain national Caritas, so he actually founds Caritas India and Caritas Pakistan. And just because it's fun to do so, where is Caritas now? So in 2004, St. John Paul II grants it canonical juridical status in recognition of its work. In 2007, Pope Benedict acknowledges Caritas' leading role in the Church's work in Deus Caritas Est. And in 2012, so this is quite recent, there are new statutes and rules for Caritas Internationalis. And development piece is Caritas Canada, so it becomes the Canadian member. Right now, it's a confederation of 162 Catholic relief, development, and social service organizations, working in 198 countries and territories, and it's actually the second largest NGO network in the world, second to the Red Cross. So, the other part that we're going to emphasize in that same quote, they contribute to institutes already established or to be established. So in certain cases where there aren't these institutes already, what developed out of that, out of the inspiration of Vatican II? So now let's look at the context of the Canadian Church. And here I actually have to thank Peter, Dr. Baltutis, because his dissertation was on the history of the Canadian Church's response to Vatican II. And what ensued was development and peace. So this is Bishop Alexander Carter, who was one of the founders, one of the bishop founders of Development and Peace. And he says, Gaudium et Spes, and our own personal contact with the bishops from Latin America, Africa, and Oceania, which is an older term, a major influence in our thinking. I doubt whether many of us return from the council unaware that we face a challenge, which could be answered in the Canadian Church. And here is the key: with a new vision, and new forms of social action, and where necessary, a new vehicle. Again, Archbishop George Bernard Winnipeg. Flat. Thank you. Obviously ESL here, so you met him. But are you from Winnipeg? Toronto, right? Have you moved here because I'm a bit here? And we'll get to the quote in a moment. But 80 Canadian bishops participated in Vatican II. And in all the documents, says this encounter actually with the global church, with the bishops from other parts of the world, was instrumental to what they came out of Vatican II, to what came out of what the bishops took out of it. And he says you cannot but be impressed by the zeal, the deep seriousness, and complete frankness with which the bishops from all parts of the world present their opinions on these and many other detailed matters. In the historical documents, it says there was a bishop, well-known bishop from Brazil, Bishop Dumhelder Câmara, who used to go around saying, this is how we interpret the gospel for the poor. How do you guys interpret it? I mean, it was a very vibrant time, you could tell. And of course, the continued reflections begin to realize how insular and sometimes narrow we can be, and you begin to appreciate something of the universality of the church. Bishop Carter, again, he talks about this encounter with other bishops, but says it was a greeting of the European and Western church. So there was a sense of, okay, something's going to come to fruition out of this encounter. In terms of the document itself, Canadian bishops were active participants in the discussion surrounding the content, and in fact, out of all the documents, Gaudium et Spes is the greatest Canadian input. And this refers back to what we said was one of the main points of Gaudium et Spes is to sort of reconsider that separation between church and world. Right? So if there's one thing Vatican II says to us, it's that the era of the total separation of the temporal and spiritual as two spheres is over. And of course now we're looking at Archbishop Joseph of Ottawa. After Vatican II, we said we would have to translate the preferential option for the poor into concrete action. And to this day, the preferential option for the poor is in our mission statement. And then finally, when the bishops come to present, and there were many negotiations about what this organization would look like, where it would be headquartered, would it be lay-run, would it be bishops and lay people, and all. I mean, it's a fascinating discussion. But what came out of it was development and peace. And the pastoral letter of the Canadian Catholic bishops, on the occasion of its 10th anniversary, reflects back and says, development and peace was conceived, as I mentioned, in the cradle of Vatican II. In responding to these realities and to the urging of concerned lay people in this country, the bishops of Canada founded Development and Peace. So in our Canadian context, there's a direct link between Gaudium et Spes and what we now know as Caritas Canada and the organ of the Canadian Church in international solidarity and social justice. So Development and Peace in Caritas Canada, in the founding documents, it says it's a response to history's greatest challenge. Actually, the pastoral letter was titled History's Greatest Challenge. So what came out of it, we are the official international development organization of the Catholic Church in Canada, the Canadian member of Caritas Internationalis, inspired by gospel values and Catholic social teaching, and in our mission statement, as I said, it says, and particularly the preferential option for the poor. So that link of actually having a vehicle to action the preferential option for the poor in Canada still exists today, even in our institutional documents. So this is section 1 done. Easy enough? Good? Okay, good. Good. Nobody is left yet, so it's compelling enough. So the work of Caritas. And we'll start with this. Can everybody see the text?
Can I just say something? I kind of use the word men, generally meant mankind or people.
Yes.
Than
Thank you. Yes, I wanted to note that. Yes, exactly. Thank you very much for noting that. I was debating whether to say that myself, but we were talking like the language at the time. But we do understand the women are not excluded in this one. Nobody's excluded. But thank you for mentioning it. So Caritas, in Latin, means love received and given. The virtue of charity is the habitual, and this is interesting because in the colloquial term, charity means something very different than the virtue of charity. Right? When we think of charity, we think of giving of our excess to an other. And the power dynamic is normally us and the other, right? Rather than a relationship of equality in God's human family. But the virtue of charity talks about the habitual and firm disposition of loving God above all things and loving our neighbor as ourselves for the love of God. Right? So there's I'm going to say a trinity of love here, right? There's ourselves, neighbor, and God. And we're all cultivating relationship and right relationship with each other. According to the Catechism of the Catholic Church, it's the source and goal of Christian practice. So when we're talking about the church works, what is Christian practice? So now going to the text. So we're going to start with, like I said, the first section, which talks about the human person. So according to Gaudium and Spes, what is Caritas in relation to the human person? And how do we use Caritas to understand ourselves, our vocation, and how to practice it? So first of all, it says we're created by God's love. Man would not exist if God didn't create us out of his love. And man cannot live fully according to truth unless he freely acknowledges that love. Secondly, we're saved and redeemed by God's love in his incarnation, Jesus Christ. It's a continuous, it's not a one-time love. It's a continuous love. And the Father sent his only Son into the world, born of the Virgin Mary, to reveal his love for us in a definitive way. And of course, because of this love, so we've received it, we're also called to love. So we're called to give it. And we're given a model in the Father, and Pope Francis says it in the Bull of Benediction, as the Father loves, so do his children. Just as he is merciful, so are we called to be merciful to each other. And of course, we're given an example, a human example, in Christ, and capacity and strength by the Holy Spirit. So Christ, by the revelation of the mystery of the Father and his love, fully reveals man to man himself, and makes his supreme calling clear. So us, as Christian people, are confirmed to the likeness of the Son. We're called to imitate Christ. And it's, we also receive the fruits of the Spirit, and because of this, the work of the Holy Spirit in us, that we become capable of discharging the new law of love. We're also called to love, as Jesus did, very actively, right? It wasn't a love that was removed from the reality of the people. And somebody has here this quote, so can I ask you to read it out loud? The person who has number 14.
The mission Jesus received from the Father was that of revealing the mystery of divine love in its fullness. This love has now been made visible and tangible in Jesus' entire life. His person is nothing but love, a love given graciously. On the basis of compassionate love, he was healed the sick who were presented to him. And with just a few loaves of bread and fish, he satisfied the enormous crowd.
So we see, like, in Jesus' example, the love wasn't just a love from afar. It was a love with the people. It was with an understanding of what the people's realities were. So called to love actively. Who has heard this recently in the Bull of Benediction? What does Pope Francis call for us to do? Merciful. So the corporal works of mercy, right? So this is affirmed again in the Year of Mercy, what we're called to do for the Year of Mercy. Can somebody read this out loud, please? Nobody has this on their sheet, actually. I forgot number 13. Okay.
Called to love actively, it is my burning desire that during this Jubilee, the Christian people may reflect on the corporal and spiritual works of mercy, and then enter more deeply into the heart of the gospel, where the poor have a special experience of God's mercy. Jesus introduces us to these works of mercy in his preaching, so that we know whether or not we are living as his disciples. Let us rediscover the corporal works of mercy, to feed the hungry, to give drink to the thirsty.
And we'll come back to this later. So called to love actively the whole human person. So somebody here has number 16. So, sorry, go ahead.
There is a growing awareness of the exalted dignity and property of the human person, since he stands above all things, and his rights and duties are universal and inviolable. Therefore, there must be made available to all men everything necessary for leading a life truly human, such as food, clothing, and shelter. The right to choose a state of life freely and to found a family. The right to education, to employment, to a good reputation, to respect, to appropriate information, to activity in accord with the upright norm of one's own conscience, to protection of privacy and rightful freedom, even in matters religious.
Thank you. So one can see here already the concept of integral human development. Human beings not just as physical, material beings, but there are spiritual components, there are political components, freedom of conscience. There are economic components, freedom, the rights to employment, the right to education. So this shows the integrality of a human being, of a human person. And then of course, we're called to love actively and receive this love and give this love, and it's available to all. So somebody actually has this quote as well, number 17.
All this holds true not only for Christians, but for all men of goodwill, in whose hearts grace works in an unseen way. For since Christ died for all men, and since the ultimate vocation of men is in fact one and divine, we ought to believe that the Holy Spirit, in a manner known only to God, offers to every man the possibility of being associated with this paschal mystery.
Thank you. So how is this translated to Catholic social teaching? Some of you sort of ogled the compendium of the social doctrine of the Church. If you're debating between Gaudium et Spes and the compendium, maybe start with Gaudium et Spes. It's a shorter read and an easier read. But essentially, the teaching of the Church has been compiled into now these principles of Catholic social teaching. So the first and most fundamental principle of Catholic social teaching is the dignity of the human person, which states that the foundation of all Catholic social teaching is the inherent dignity of the human person, as created in the image and likeness of God. So what does the Church call for? The integral human development, which concerns the well-being of each person. So this is the reference to the all, every person. And we're going to focus on that, we're going to pause on that before we go on to the other aspects here. As Development and Peace, how we've applied this is that even in 1967, the bishops had said this is an organization that puts itself at the service of all men, without the distinction of race, belief, or ideology. So we're called from the very start to love and to serve all people. And the example I'm going to use here is actually from Madagascar. And I'm going to add to this, because it's an organization I work for, so I can add to our mission statement, I guess, is sometimes we're called to love all people, not just regardless of race, ideology, and belief, but also, I'm going to say, geopolitical importance, or interest, or what we are presented with in terms of information. Sometimes certain situations are out of our sight, and sometimes they're just out of our interest. A couple of years ago, I was in Madagascar, as Father had mentioned. And one of the things that struck me the most is that many people don't know where the country is. I mean, I went to transfer money to our partners there, and folk at the Royal Bank said, "Is that a real country?" I'm like, no, it's just a Disney movie. You know, like it's an actual country. Like, people live there. Lots of people live there. Madagascar in 2012 was hit by a Cyclone Giovanna, or Tropical Storm Irina, that was extremely devastating to it. Already Madagascar politically is not favorable to the World Bank and the IMF, so it doesn't get assistance. It doesn't get very much assistance. The president that they had is somebody who's popularly voted in, but not recognized by the international community. So they're even more vulnerable because many countries and even our international systems exclude them. So it has a very, very high rate of poverty. When the cyclone happened, did anybody hear about this natural disaster? This very devastating? No. Why do you think that is?
Because they're excluded.
Because they're excluded. Because they're not of geopolitical interest to Canada. Because our media doesn't care about things that are this far away. It literally is the other side of the world. Literally. You know, like north, south, east, west. It's other side of the world for Canada. And in this situation, 60% of people's homes were destroyed. At least 60,000 people were homeless, but over 250,000 were affected by the storm. And like I said, it's not like they received any aid either, right? In a situation like the Philippines and Haiti, more well known, we have great diaspora communities here. When you go to these countries, I mean, every organization under the sun is present. In this one community of Brickaville, which we had a chance to go to, nobody was there. It was a community that was entirely wiped out, and the only organizations were there were the Caritas organizations. So the Bishops' Conference of Madagascar had their own Caritas, so Caritas Madagascar, Catholic Relief Services, which is our US sister agency, and us. There were no posters everywhere for water and sanitation help or shelter here, or none of that. And one of the most devastating things is to hear the community say that to you. Is to say, on top of the fact that our homes are destroyed, that we've become displaced, that we've lost family, that we feel ignored, neglected, unseen. And yet in situations like this, and this isn't a shaming exercise, I mean, I was just as much a person that learned from this situation as anybody else, but to realize that in the way that we receive information in our global family, there are a lot of unseens. Especially when we're motivated to love those who are near, who are visible, who we hear about, without actually asking who isn't seen, who is the most vulnerable. So in a situation like this, it's always a great delight, and this is actually a member of our board of directors representing Alberta, and what the Francophone Parish in Edmonton decided that, you know, they're still kids at the end of the day. They'll probably want to play soccer. So their contribution to this effort was soccer balls. I mean, Development of Peace contributed to building shelters, of course, and to a number of things. But at the end of the day, there's always a sense of play. So this was the village chief. And even in this village, and we'll talk about the preferential option for the poor a little bit later, but the first people who were to get support were the single moms, like the single-headed households. Most of the times in natural disasters, it's actually the dads that get affected, right? Because they're mostly either fisher folk if they live on the coast, so they're first actually to pass away. But a lot of people with disability as well, the elderly. So even in the margins of a marginalized community, those are the people you're called to support first. And the margins of our site, right? In our media, the margins of our political interest, or sometimes our own community interest. So we're called to love everybody. And what does that look like? So the next element of the principle of Catholic social teaching, the duty of the human person that I want to address, is the every dimension: economic, political, social, ecological, and spiritual. So in development and peace, this is actually a central part of how we do development. In response to crisis, we work with local organizations to provide our physical needs. So this is traditional emergency relief, shelter, bedding, food, cooking supplies, hygiene kits. But emotional needs, actually one of the areas that's most underfunded is psychosocial support. And it's funny because sometimes we, like at a personal level, you understand that once you've endured trauma or crisis, you need to go to a counselor, right? At the international level, somehow that element tends to be neglected quite a bit. That, what's neglected here too, yes. But essentially, if somebody suffered, and I saw this in the Philippines, I was there a little less than a year, or a bit over a year, from Typhoon Yolanda. And actually, there had been a Typhoon Ruby in November of 2014. So the Philippines had 2 super typhoons, one year after another. The moment it rained, what happened to the children? Panic, total panic, right? So in a case like that, when you're considering how do you support a community that's undergone such a traumatic event, you need to consider emotional needs. It's actually fundamental, right? Somebody who's still experiencing trauma from rain is not likely to be able to go and fish for their food anymore, right? So it seems, again, very basic, but very neglected. Social needs, support the community organizations. So one of the things we support in the Philippines is building of a church, sacred spaces. It's not just about shelter. Where do people get their spiritual needs addressed? Political needs. So civic education, advocacy, legal support. Often people don't know their rights, and we'll talk about the Philippines, I seem to be talking about it a lot already, but it's that people don't know their land rights. So the government says you're evicted. And they say, where do we go? We're already landless. Where do we go? And we'll talk about the role of the church in that case. What does the church do to defend the people who essentially could be made homeless just because they don't know what their rights are? Economic needs, so livelihood support. So even when we talk about emergency relief, we often do it in ways that affirm the dignity of the person. So rather than give food, sometimes if they're really vulnerable, we give money so that they can choose which food to buy, right? The element of choice. Sometimes if they're capable, then you create cash for work programs so that they earn money so that then they can buy food. Then they don't feel like, again, the power dynamic, right? You're here and they're over there and they're just recipients of aid. But you affirm, you equalize, you affirm the dignity of that person. And of course, the building process is led by local leaders. And the community participates in decisions that affect them. Oh, thank you. So the example I'd like to use here is our program in Haiti.
Ce tremblement de terre, en 33 minutes, a causé la mort de plus de 200 000 personnes et a ravagé les villes de Léogane, de Petit-Gouave, de Port-au-Prince surtout, à plus de 60-70%. La plupart des locaux administratifs, beaucoup de maisons se sont effondrées, ruinant aussi d'une certaine façon l'économie du pays.
Le Réseau national de défense des droits humains, c'est une organisation de promotion et de défense des droits humains justement, qui se donne pour mission de lutter pour l'établissement en Haïti d'un état de droit.
Après le 12 janvier 2010, on a considéré les Haïtiens comme des victimes, comme des sinistrés, mais on oubliait totalement que ce sont avant tout des êtres humains qui ont une dignité et qui méritent d'être respectés. RNDDH ne se contentait pas seulement de documenter, de monitorer justement les interventions humanitaires, mais nos interventions, nous avons essayé de montrer à tous et à toutes il y a une façon de faire qui soit acceptable, qui tienne compte justement de la dignité humaine.
Les logements sociaux sont un exemple de communauté intégrale. Nous n'offrons pas seulement un espace physique aux gens, mais nous essayons de développer le sens de communauté, d'appartenance et donner aux gens des services pour le développement de leur famille et des enfants.
Nous avons toujours parlé, disons, de la dignité de la personne humaine, donc c'est extrêmement important que si nous entrons dans la logique de construction, eh bien, il fallait aussi donner des maisons dignes, que les gens se sentent revalorisés, disons, dans leur habitat. Et c'est ce que nous avons fait avec précisément l'aide de développement IP.
tous les enfants sont des enfants. Tout petit monde, c'est petit monde. Ils ont tous les mêmes droits. Donc on fait tout ce qu'on peut pour aider les enfants à vivre comme hommes et femmes à part entière, les considérer comme tels, les traiter comme tels.
Moi, dis nous merci en pile. Merci en pile pour Kaila. Nous sommes contents. Nous dormons bien parce que nous sommes pas à l'aise. Nous sommes pas à l'aise. Tout le monde vient nous dormir bien à Timounio. Parce que depuis que nous vivons avec un voisin, nous faisons une seule famille. Tant que c'est famille, nous faisons une seule famille.
So, dignity of the human person, every person in every dimension. So just to end this section on the human person, Caritas is also essential for, we're talking about the Great Commission. It's essential for evangelization, according to Gaudium and Spes. And in fact, the lack thereof can be an offense. So if somebody can read the quote number 19.
The remedy which must be applied to atheism, however, is to be sought in a proper presentation of the Church's teaching, as well as in the integral life of the Church and her members. The faith needs to prove its fruitfulness by penetrating the believer's entire life, including its worldly dimensions, and by activating him toward justice and love, especially regarding the needy.
And one example I'm going to use now from Burkina Faso that really testified to this. You may know that in 2012, seems to be a big year, there was a food crisis in the Sahel, inspired not only by drought, but also just by food speculation on food prices. There were a number of sort of systemic conditions that led to this. One country that was particularly affected is Burkina Faso. Had anybody heard of Burkina Faso before? Did you know it is the Upper Volta? Some people? Yes. Burkina Faso is in West Africa. A number of countries were affected, Mali, Niger. Burkina Faso is actually 20% Christian, so the majority are Muslim. And in Burkina Faso, there's a particular area called Farid, actually the community is 90% Muslim. And they were particularly affected by the drought. 90% of families were affected. And we're talking affected as in a meal a day, maximum, that they were able to eat. And of course, and one of the things I learned when we think of drought and hunger is beyond the physical sensation. What happens? Children cry. When children cry, their parents give them their food. Parents aren't able to work. Children aren't able to go to school. Sometimes you're forced to consider who in your children is able to work. You send them off to gold mines, which aren't exactly safe to work in. The father sometimes leaves the home to search for work, doesn't find work. Sometimes out of shame doesn't come home. Women go back to their parental homes. Again, they don't find food. Where do they end up going? So essentially what I learned in that situation is that hunger, when you think of drought and hunger, is not, what happens to you is not just a physical effect. It becomes very deeply social. And families become affected. The sense of one of the ladies that was talking was telling me she felt shame as a mother, not being able to feed her 5 children. So again, when we look at how the human person is affected, it's not just the material. The most amazing thing about this was the role of the church. So Development of Peace is a member of something called the Canadian Food Grains Bank, which is 15 church organizations working specifically on the issue of hunger. The way that the Canadian Food Grains Bank works is that there's sort of a bank of money, and whoever has partners that have capacity locally, they support this partner. In Burkina Faso, none of the 15 church organizations in Canada had partners except for Development and Peace. And it was essentially our Caritas sister agency, Caritas Burkina Faso, or OCABES. So to me, one of the most remarkable things was to realize there's this Christian zeal to support. And the only way you could actually support like the lives and livelihood of people is through the church. One of the most fascinating things I personally saw was to see members of this community gathered in a church hall. Most of these people not being Christian. But they come and gather to the church hall first because that's where they found life. They were able to get seeds and food and cash vouchers and cash for work to be able to live. So what better witness than that, than to say, here, we offer you just even the basic needs of life. And I mean, life in many dimensions. But to just see the community gathered without any, nobody had identity cards, in the church hall to say, who are you and what are you doing here? But the church's role was to be at the forefront of protecting the life and dignity of the people. And people gathered to speak to that. And again, many of the stories you heard were we're here, not just because we came on the first time, but we're coming here on the second occasion to thank the church and now Canadian members of the church for this life-saving work you're doing. So when I think of evangelization, I think what better way to be a witness, to be that lamp, the salt of the earth, than to be present with the people that need you the most, right? So to me, it was a very remarkable experience because when people traditionally think of Burkina Faso, they don't think Catholic country, and yet the Catholic Church is at the forefront of defending the life and dignity of the people. So that's Kuano. Since she was I was mentioning her, Kuano was a widow, actually, a 39-year-old widow, mother of 5. She had to send her oldest to a gold mine, and the rest of her kids were really young. And she's the one that said, the biggest impact of the Jart on me was the sense of shame. And then, of course, when you hear again, okay, well, what was done to support you? And it was essentially here are some peanut seeds. And now she's an entrepreneur, and she says, now I have 500 kilograms of peanuts that I sell a year, and now I'm starting my own business. And then the sense of pride that comes out of that. Again, we think of hunger as something so simple. But again, it was such a witness to the work of the church in Burkina Faso. Don't be fooled by the van. The doors did not close. So it was kind of treacherous. Nice van. And then finally, on the human person, the work of Caritas is actually essential for our salvation. And Pope Francis quotes St. John of the Cross in the Bull of Benediction. Let's not forget the words of St. John of the Cross. As we prepare to leave this life, we'll be judged on the basis of love. So what does Gaudium and Spes say about Caritas and the love of God and our call to love God in relation to the human community? So went from the human person to the community now. And that's, you'll see that in chapter 2. So you'll also see a progression in the quotes. So loving God and loving one's neighbor are fulfilled in each other. Secondly, it says the social order must be animated by love. And somebody here has quote number 21. Can you read that, please?
The social order must work to the benefit of the human person. It must be founded on truth, built on justice, and animated by love. An improvement in attitudes and abundant changes in society will have to take place if these objectives are to be gained.
It goes on to say that we're called to be active agents of love in our community. So, the social order won't just change itself, right? We actually have to participate in that work. So can somebody read quote number 22 now?
We are called to be the active agents of love. Profound and rapid changes make it more necessary that no one ignoring the trend of events or drugged by laziness content himself with a merely individualistic morality. It grows increasingly true that the obligations of justice and love are fulfilled only if each person, contributing to the common good, according to his own abilities and the needs of others, also promotes and assists the public and private institutions dedicated to bettering the conditions of human life.
Let's play it. I Spy, a principle of Catholic social teaching here. There's a principle of Catholic social teaching named here, which we'll refer to. I'm going to defer to Kathleen if nobody says anything.
The common good is listed explicitly.
The common good. And before we actually pause on that principle, Gaudium et Spes goes on to say, the Council Fathers go on to say, the greater our capacity, or they use the word power, the greater our power, the greater our responsibility. So for the greater man's power becomes, the farther his individual and community responsibility extends. So we have a responsibility to the common good, which increases in situations or cases where you have a lot of capacity. And I would say in Canada, in most cases, comparatively, we have a lot of capacity. So what is the principle of the common good and how is it defined? We must all consider the good of others and the good of the whole human family organizing our society. Human dignity can only be realized and protected through our relationship with society at large. We must love our neighbor locally and globally and prioritize the good of the human family over commercial interests. So here are a number of elements we need to highlight, locally and globally. At the time, Gaudium et Spes, one of the things it addresses, one of the signs of the times, is globalization. We are now in a globalized world. So the idea of the common good in relation to our neighbor becomes even more complex, right? It's not our immediate physical neighbor, but our world neighbor. And in fact, look at our schools and the diversity of our communities. Global is local now. How we at Development and Peace have applied this, and this particularly, it relates very well actually to stewardship of creation. And that's a different principle, but when we talk about creation and ecological justice, and very practically something like water, sometimes people make the equation out to be, us versus the polar bears, like we have to behave better so we can save the polar bears, but in fact the equation should be us, or like some people's lifestyles, and how other people are impacted, right? It's not us and the polar bears, it's us and our neighbors, essentially. So when we talk about something like water, we had an awareness-raising campaign about the privatizing of water in certain countries that took away from people's water source. And you think of water sources, again, not simple like hunger, hunger can be unpacked in many different ways, but not being able to access drinkable water also impacts your capacity to farm. It impacts your capacity to stay on your land. Sometimes it forces you to move into conditions that are not very promotive of your human dignity. So again, it's a complex issue. So the way that we've applied the common good is to say, when there's something as basic for life as water, or sometimes land, or I'm trying to think of other cases, but essentially the issue of food is a human right, water is a human right, and should be available to all, is something that we've really applied in a lot of our campaigns. And to always consider who relies on this, and whose voice should be taken into consideration before we make these decisions. And sometimes these are global decisions very far removed from the realities of the people. One very practical example, again, with the water, was a community in Indonesia that essentially was using the water for rice paddies. How many people here actually have seen rice fields before? What do they look like? What's most remarkable about them? Water, lots of water, right? So one of the communities we were working with in Indonesia literally went to the water source and it was fenced off one day. And they had no control, they didn't know who done it, but essentially they lost not just the capacity to have drinkable water, but to be able to grow rice. So some of the work of the church there and the community organizations there was to say, can we protect this water source because there's an issue here of people's lives and livelihoods. So again, this is how we've applied it to something as basic as water. So moving on, who do we love? So first of all, everyone, right? We already said this love is available to all. But this goes on also in the human community, or in the community, not just as a human being who are you called to love everybody in your life, but as a community we're called to love everyone. So God has willed that all men constitute one family and treat one another in a spirit of brotherhood. Every social group must take account of the needs and legitimate aspirations of other groups, and even of the general welfare of the entire human family. So the principle here is the principle of solidarity. Where each of us is part of the human family, and this is actually the language of the principle. And we're all interconnected and interdependent. Solidarity is a recognition that we are all in this together, and is a commitment to strengthen community and promote a just society. So how we've applied that at Development and Peace is actually how we work with partners. We call ourselves an international solidarity organization, or a movement for international solidarity. We stand with our partners as equals, and to support their efforts by fundraising, by participating in our own education, mobilization, advocacy efforts. So when we have education campaigns here, it's not something we dreamed up in our head office in Montreal or Toronto. Actually, a great consultation process happens with the people most impacted to say, what are the issues we should be addressing here in Canada in support of you? Now I get to talk about the Philippines. One of the most remarkable, actually, recent projects that I have had the pleasure of witnessing is a reconstruction project in the Philippines. So, as most of us know, in 2013, Typhoon Yolanda, or Haiyan, hit sort of the central region of the Philippines, the Eastern Visayas. According to official counts, 6,000 people died. According to unofficial counts, that number is actually up to triple, so it's about 18,000 people. And it's great devastation. There are mass graves actually everywhere in some of these neighborhoods. Actually, some churchyards have been made into mass graves. Of course, those most impacted are already those who are already poor and vulnerable. This is actually one of the communities where we're working with. It's called Barangay, a neighborhood at 56A. And the community already doesn't own any land, and in fact, it doesn't own any land that builds its homes on stilts in the water. So when you think of, and people describe the typhoon, or in some areas of Tacloban, it was like, think of a 10 meter wall of water that's coming at you for 6 hours, wave after wave. Right? The buildings are insane. Actually, one of the funniest sights is to see an entire ship, like literally inland. That devastation was really just unimaginable. You can understand trauma afterwards. And these poor folk are the first impacted. And these poor folk are fisher folk. So most of the men, and you have a lot of families now that are headed by women, just died at sea. So one of the projects we're working on is called the Pope Francis Village. The Pope Francis Village was conceived as a way not to dislocate the people. So what happens to fisher folk when you take them up to the mountains? Their livelihood is lost, right? So, yeah. So one of the things was to say, how do you house them safely? How do you provide them with safe shelter, but also not dislocate them totally? And also remove them from land, right? Because there's an attachment to land. So in the Pope Francis Village, we're actually working with 560 families, the most vulnerable on the coast. The communities themselves selected the most vulnerable families to be relocated. And this work here is actually one of the ways that Development and Peace works that has been renowned in construction. So about 10 years ago, we worked on a similar project in Indonesia during the 2004 tsunami. And it sounds funny to say this, but Bill Clinton came to visit the project. The way of doing reconstruction to include people and partners as equals actually makes, and forget the ethics of it, but makes the project even more sustainable when people own what they're doing. So I actually wanted to show you the trailer of a documentary that's being made on this, so you can get a bit of the flavor of the process of it and what are some of the issues are. It's about 2 minutes.
Maliit mo ng tubig hanggang paa, hanggang dumating ng tuhod. Pagdating mo ng tuhod, natakot na po kami. Hindi ko na po nakita yung bahay namin. Kasi po nung napumunta po kami sa dati namin lugar, tubig na po siya, wala na pong bahay na nakatayo.
What happens to the forgotten when a disaster strikes? Will they continue to be forgotten? Made even more invisible and powerless by everything they've lost?
Ngayon po, yung tinitirahan po namin, tela, mainit, yung sahig po, plastic, madali pong hatgatin ng mga insekto, lalo po ng mga daga. Parang wala po kami idea nun kung paano po kami hingin tulong.
But what happens when you bring the people together? When they are given a voice and a chance to be heard? When they know how to take action?
Noong di namin alam paano kami makakahingi ng tulong sa gobyerno. Gobyerno yan, hindi kami pagbibigyan yan. So kailangan ng pag-organisa, kailangan ng sama-samang pagkilos. Kailangan ng iisang boses at iisang kanta para marinig ng gobyerno kung ano. Kaya nandito po ang UPA para organisahin sila, magkaroon sila ng iisang galaw, iisang organisasyon para marinig sila ng gobyerno at ng iba pa.
Development and peace is daring to try another way. It is giving power to the people. 600 families will transform a piece of land into new homes, into a new community, into new lives.
It's really challenging, like, how are we going to build houses considering this kind of terrain?
What will their journey be?
I got to watch a lot of this participatory community action, and at the time I witnessed a workshop where community architects and engineers were supporting representatives from the communities on how to procure materials. Like everything with toy trucks, and if somebody tells you this much sand or this much wood, how do you measure, how do you argue? But it was so empowering to see the community, who could have been very easily perceived as victims of a disaster. Let's do everything for them. Let's determine even where they get to live, what types of homes they get. But to see them now become agents in their own community and to, again, affirm that dignity and to say, well, here's your contribution to where you live, how you live, and to the whole process. It was fascinating. I thought, I was telling my husband later, he's like, you probably can't even, if somebody, if somebody asked you to buy wood here, you probably wouldn't even get a fair price, right? You probably wouldn't even know how to negotiate yourself. And yet the community members were learning all these things. So again, it's the spirit of solidarity, not us here and them, the recipients, but really sort of a vision of one human family. And how do you, when you perceive of your brothers and sisters as one human family, it really impacts how you do things. So who else do we love? Those that are different from us. In Gaudium et Spes, the Council Fathers say, respect and love ought to be extended also to those who think or act differently than we do, in social, political, and even religious matters. So we don't only work with those that we like or agree with, right? We don't ask, well, what's your take on something or other? What's your take on Canada's federal government? And it's only then that we'll give you money. Sometimes the government would like us to do that, I think. But that's not how we work. Who do we love? Our enemies. The teaching of Christ even requires that we forgive injuries and extend the law of love to include every enemy. And of course, this is very much affirmed in the Bull of Indiction. Pardoning offenses becomes the clearest expression of merciful love. And for us Christians, it's an imperative from which we cannot excuse ourselves. Who do we love? Especially those on the margins. And this is there's an entire section dedicated to this in Gaudium et Spes. Never yet has the human race enjoyed such an abundance of wealth, resources, and economic power, and yet a huge proportion of the world's citizens are still tormented by hunger and poverty. And since then, do you think the gap has increased or decreased? Increased significantly. Sorry? And the Council Fathers go on to say, this council lays stress on reverence for man. Everyone must consider his neighbor without exception. And goes on to say this, so as not to imitate the rich man who had no concern for the poor man Lazarus, and we all know how that story ends. So there's a bit of a caution there too, right? Who do we love, especially those on the margins? And somebody has a quote here again, quote number 35. Can you read that out, please?
While an immense number of people lack the absolute necessities of life, some, even in less advanced areas, live in luxury or squander wealth. Extravagance and wretchedness exist side by side. While a few enjoy very great power of choice, the majority are deprived of almost all possibility of acting in their own initiative and responsibility, and often subsist in living and working condition unworthy of a human person. Many reforms of the socio-economic realm and a change of mentality and attitude are required of all.
Thank you. And so how do we respond? And it was very insightful then, still insightful now. The fathers of the church hold this opinion. We're obliged to come to the relief of the poor, not merely out of our superfluous goods. And in fact, reverses it again. Feeding the man dying of hunger, because if you have not fed him, you have killed him. Right? So it's not a giving of excess. In fact, it has to be a giving of self, what's rightly and justly theirs. And of course, the Holy Father reaffirms that in the Bull of Benediction. In this holy year, we look forward to the experience of opening our hearts to those living on the outermost fringes of society, fringes which modern society itself creates. And during this Jubilee, so this is the call, the Church will be called even more to heal those wounds. And here, of course, the principle of the preferential option for the poor, sometimes referred to as the universal destination of goods. The moral test of any society is based on how the most vulnerable are treated. God's love is universal. So this principle does not intend that we should focus on the poor to the exclusion of others, but rather to prioritize those who are in most need of our solidarity. In Canada, our partners work with the most poor and vulnerable, and their voices take precedence in our educational materials, providing a space in our Canadian society. So even in how we operate here, I mean, this is an anomaly, but I hope the most valuable thing I've done today is share the experiences of our partners in our work. But you'll note every Lent we have solidarity visitors, and we just actually had a visitor to the Diocese of Calgary in March from Lebanon. These are just some of the others that have come. In our videos, testimonies from Ethiopia, Philippines, and Honduras, actually our YouTube channel is stellar for that. And of course, even our campaign materials have our partners all known, right? So it's not us speaking for them. Hopefully we just get them to speak for themselves, right? Because that's also important. You acknowledge their voice. Internationally, even during humanitarian emergencies, we work with local partners who are in the best position to reach out and provide aid to the most vulnerable individuals. And now I'm going to do something that might not be very favorable with many people, but it's not a situation we've all come to experience or be exposed to lately. Syria. So the interesting thing about Syria is, when did the conflict start in Syria? 5 years ago, 2012? So 2011, March of 2011, so 5 years ago. I hope it didn't say that in the slide, sometimes it does. But when did people actually start responding? Was it 5 years ago? It's after the baby on the beach. So the assessment again of who's most vulnerable or who most needs our help was in this case very much impacted by what we saw in the media. right, rather than by the reality of the situation. So that's something for us too is, in a way, very heartening that people eventually responded, but very disheartening that it was, again, a forgotten situation for a very long period of time. But even in Syria, so when we look at Syria, a lot of times we think of the refugee crisis, and there is a refugee crisis. But in these eras, so we know the eras of the people going out. What are the eras of the people in the countries? Who are these people? Internally displaced persons. It's because you've been with me 2 or 3 sessions already, empty. Yes, and looking after a Syrian family. So a lot of you have encountered this, in Calgary. But these are internally displaced persons. These persons actually don't have any protection under international humanitarian law because they're in their country, right? There's technically the responsibility of their government, even if it doesn't exist at the moment. So when we as development do analysis of who's the most vulnerable, who is the most poor in a situation even like this conflict in Syria, we see this. Today, almost 250,000 people who have died, over 1 million wounded, 6.5 internally displaced million, 4.2 million refugees, 500 of those in Europe, 25,000 refugees in Canada. When we apply the preferential option for the poor, who is it that we're serving the most? As an organization, where would we be compelled to go? The internally displaced. So it's actually just analysis who's most vulnerable, who has least protection, even though it's very risky to actually support in Syria, but most of our efforts are placed in supporting those trapped in Syria. And actually, one of the programs that I'd like to share with you today, so for the internally displaced, again, if you look at the integral human person, food baskets and food aid, but also psychosocial support, also peace building, right? Because the conflict's going to end, and how do people live together in Syria when they've experienced so much violence, right? So there are a number of areas of intervention. But one of the projects I actually wanted to share with you, who's even more vulnerable, people in Syria, who's even more vulnerable in that situation, children, right? Their capacity to communicate trauma is also sometimes limited, right? They carry trauma for longer. There are actually generational impacts for not dealing with trauma in children. Who's even more vulnerable in that group are the disabled children. So one of the programs that we're supporting there, so if you can imagine, in Syria, children with disabilities, is actually run by the Sisters of Sacred Heart, who actually now have 4 centers catering to children with disabilities in the city of Homs. It's considered one of the calmest cities in Syria, if you can make that comparison. But essentially, they have 100 youth between the ages of 5 and 25 on a daily basis. And it's open to everybody. And of course, who's going to think of disability when you're thinking of conflict, right? And yet somebody has to. There, even within your communities, even in Syria, there are the more vulnerable, right? So it's sometimes a strange way to do an analysis of preferential option for the poor, but it really checks your blind spots for who is most vulnerable. Who do we consider most vulnerable? Just some pictures, because I think it's a beautiful center. So that's some of our stuff in Syria. We're almost done here. I know I'm going a bit over time. So to cap off the aspect of the community, this love and service in action is actually a gift of the Spirit. So again from Gaudium and Spes, he summons others to dedicate themselves to the earthly service of men and to make ready the material of the celestial realm by this ministry of theirs. This is talking about the Spirit, so there's a quote before but referred to the Holy Spirit. Yet he frees them, all of them, so that by putting aside love of self and bringing all earthly resources into the service of human life, they can devote themselves to the future, when humanity itself will become an offering accepted by God. So essentially, it's the work of cultivating the kingdom of God on earth. And then finally, because this is compelling always to me, is necessary for salvation. So can somebody read the very short quote, number 41?
A Christian who neglects his temporal duties, neglects his duties toward his neighbor, and even God, and jeopardizes his eternal salvation, Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 43.
Thank you. So now we come to the role of the church. The church actually is called to manifest, exercise, mediate, and reflect, and these are all verbs used in the various texts, God's love. So for every benefit which the people of God can offer to the human family stems from the fact that the church is the universal sacrament of salvation, simultaneously manifesting and exercising the mystery of God's love. And of course, we get our example from Christ. So the church's first truth is the love of Christ. The church is called, according to Gaudium et Spes, to put faith and charity into practice, especially for the needy. So this is an essential role of church. And the Council Fathers say the church can and indeed should initiate activities on behalf of all men. And in fact, Pope Francis goes further. He says, the church's very credibility is seen in how she shows merciful and compassionate love. So it's in this action of love that the church becomes credible. So here, the section is who is the church? And Gaudium et Spes outlined very distinct roles. And if you recall from Lumen Gentium, what was the main departure in Lumen Gentium about who is the church from previous teaching?
Lay people.
The people of God, the role of the lay people. So, number 48.
Laymen should also know that it is generally the function of their well-formed Christian conscience to see that the divine law is inscribed in the life of the earthly city. From priests, they may look for spiritual light and nourishment, enlightened by Christian wisdom, and giving close attention to the teaching authority of the Church. Let the layman take on his own distinctive role.
And this was something actually, in reading the discussions of the bishops in creating development peace, it became one of those elements that was part of its formative identity. The development of peace would be essentially for the people of God, by the people of God, but would have a very lay character. So this is actually our basic principles of orientation. The active men and women of development and peace are therefore recruited from among the whole people of God. And everyone, bishops, priests, religious, and lay people, are called to promote its goals. And yet the leadership of the organization is a 21-member national council, 2 of which are bishops and 19 of which are, it used to be, now the bishops actually sit in the liaison committee, but essentially now it's lay represented and lay run. And these are just some pictures of some lovely folk in our western region. So, who's the church? There's also a role for the organized laity, which, as you will note, there's a diocesan council here. So we operate at a parish level, but also at the diocesan level. So, Gaudium et Spes, the church fathers say, the church recognizes that worthy elements are found in today's social movements, especially in evolution towards unity. The promotion of unity belongs to the innermost nature of the church, for she is, thanks to her relationship with Christ, a sacramental sign and an instrument of intimate union with God and of the unity of the whole human race. So this element of unity, the work of the Spirit in unity, is very important. And in fact, one of the early educational documents we had at Development of Peace was a pamphlet that talked about the spirituality of social movements. And in fact, in our general bylaws, Development of Peace is described as a democratic movement of international solidarity. It's a movement. And again, these are Development of Peace members moving and praying together and listening to, at the top is Archbishop Petipa during a regional assembly, which is again in Grand Prairie this year, cooking for us. I don't know what Bill is doing, but holding a flower. Making decisions. So,
Symbol of solidarity.
A symbol of solidarity, right. Thank you. But the people moving. At the same time, the church also says, in Gaudium and Spes, the church fathers say there is also a role for professionals, or experts, we're going to call them. For thus, the ability to express Christ's message in its own ways developed in each nation, and at the same time, there's fostered a living exchange between the church and the diverse cultures of people. To promote such an exchange, especially in our days, the church requires the special help of those who live in the world, are versed in different institutions and specialties, and grasp their innermost significance in the eyes of both believers and unbelievers. We're a small staff of 55 people, but the backgrounds of staff, our international program staff, I would say there's a collective experience of over 200 years of working with communities. When you ask our program officer in charge of Brazil, she knows Brazil inside out, every nook and cranny, the history of the church in Brazil. Our Philippines program officer used to work for Caritas Philippines. The folk in Canada have come from social movement backgrounds. Kathleen from youth ministry, where she engages our Catholic school students in social justice. The animator who's here, who's doing her Master's of Divinity. So people who are able to take these theological concepts and translate them into action in the world. And to be able to bridge some of these languages in the context we live in, but also, and to go to them and to enact them through our faith. So we do have a professional organization, and this is our staff in Montreal during our staff day. And don't be fooled, I was looking, I'm like, there's a lot of women, which is lovely, but they're all standing at the back, all our gentlemen. So we're a fairly representative group. They're tall, sort of, yes. And then finally, for the role of the church, there's a role for professional organizations, right? So the church fathers say, for the spirit of charity does not forbid, but on the contrary commands that charitable activity be carried out in a careful and orderly manner. And this is especially true in today's world, where there's almost if I care about something, and this is not a bad inclination, I'm not talking about that, but I care about something, so I act on it. Without a careful consideration for the context, the impact of your actions, who's already there supporting, who's not being supported. So some of the ways we mitigate that as an organization is actually a long-term donation program. And we're often told, well, I want to give to this case, I want to give to this case. And we encourage people to say, you know what, you may want to, and that's wonderful, but what about the Madagascars of the world? You may not see them, you may not actually know much about them, but we do. And we need to ensure that everybody, so this be done in a careful and orderly manner, right? So that we don't also lose sight of who's not being supported. And of course, since our inception, and this was interesting for me to learn about, our administration costs have been under 10%. That's actually in our bylaw, that our administration costs are under 10%. And despite education being our second mandate, only 14% of our funds go towards in Canada programs. So that too is for us, it's not just something we show for, accountability. It's part of our mission and principles of the church, right? To say you have to do this in a careful and orderly manner. The other way we do this in an orderly manner is because we're part of the Caritas network. It's super easy to actually literally call up our neighbors in, Caritas UK, CAFOD, or SKIA, who actually are our partners in Ethiopia, to say, hey, what are you doing? Do you already have a relationship there? Do you know this local organization? Do you want to go in together so that if, God forbid, our funding environment in Canada doesn't, support us anymore, that at least these communities are not left stranded? So again, to do it in an orderly manner. The other organization, or the Catholic network we belong to, SITSE. So it's a number of Catholic international development organizations that together work specifically on education and advocacy. So working in these networks enables us to say we're not going to be the lone wolf to go in there without any consideration of who else has better capacity or who's already doing something. So, and then finally, and this is very, very short because nobody wants to hear me talk about development and peace, despite how much I love my work and have ultimate respect for the organization I represent, but the work of Caritas Canada. So finally, what does this look like in Canada? Development and Peace is a democratic movement for international solidarity. We were founded by the bishops in 1967. So again, our relationship with the Catholic bishops is instrumental. And we're inspired by the values of the gospel, Catholic social teaching, particularly preferential option for the poor. So it all ties in nicely together. Here's the package. And the organization is governed by a democratically elected lay leadership accountable to its members. So Martin, the gentleman in Madagascar with the hat and the soccer balls, he's the one who's representing members in Alberta and Northwest Territories at the moment. Lovely gentleman. Its objectives are to promote international solidarity and integral human development. So we don't shy away from this language, even though sort of an international development jargon, it's like, what are you guys talking about? But essentially, our faith permeates everything we do. So we do this through an education and fundraising program in Canada and financial support to socioeconomic projects in developing countries. So note this, one of the earlier slides talks about the practical recommendation of Vatican II to create an organization. It says, it regards it as opportune that an organism of the Universal Church be set up. The role of such an organism would be to stimulate the Catholic community, so think about our education and fundraising work in Canada, to promote progress in needy regions, think of our emergency relief and humanitarian aid programs, and international social justice, which is our long-term development through partnerships. So this is working at root causes of things. So to this day, our organization enacts the first sort of call of Vatican II through Gaudium and Spes to be that for the church. And the Canadian bishops were very intentional about these things. So education and action, and of course it starts here. So when people talk about what is this 14% that goes to in-Canada programs, this is affirmed actually in the Bull of Benediction. And this whole year we look forward to the experience of opening our hearts. It has to start with opening our hearts to those living on the outermost fringes of society. And then to show our love very concretely, intentions, attitudes, and behaviors. So our fall campaign, which happens in the fall, is normally to raise awareness and educate people about these global local issues affecting our most impoverished and vulnerable brothers and sisters, and provide a meaningful action for Canadians to advocate for structural changes. So last year was so much, 2 years ago was so much love, small family farmers feed the world. But we also do this education year-round, and mostly thanks to Kathleen's work in the Catholic schools. So we now have African images, so a graphic novel. Help the Mustard Seed Grow, which is something for actually younger children to connect with Haiti and Burundi, with youth organizations in Haiti and Burundi. And of course the Think Fast program, and a multitude of other tools that we try to work on, including curricular resources, the latest thing. Emergency relief. So this is actually what we relate very practically to the corporal works of mercy. Feed the hungry, give drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, welcome the stranger, heal the sick, visit the imprisoned, and bury the dead. And unfortunately, the last couple of years have been plenty abundant of emergency situations. And then of course our long-term development. And here I especially, and because I actually brought a lot of information in our Syria campaign, we've rejected all forms of anger and hate that lead to violence. If we had had the kind of patience God shows, who is so patient with us, and if we have commended our brothers and sisters to the Lord in prayer. The work of long-term development is work that requires a lot of perseverance. It really requires sort of a change of response to how we deal with things. The patience to dig a bit deeper and not accept the simplicity of things. But it's what hopefully we're trying to do. And in Calgary, we mostly raise awareness of these situations during Lent, where we raise awareness about particular situations every year, and engage Canadians in actions to support, and this is mostly done through fundraising, and here it happens, of course, through Together in Action. On the ground, we work with close to 150 community organizations in over 30 countries, and of course, we believe that the poor must be authors of this destiny. Very quickly work through partnership approach. It's a programmatic approach, so they're not isolated projects. Capacity building, strengthening institutions. We start with modest contributions. Our international programs director calls it like courtship, like you first go out with ice cream, and then you move on to maybe dinner. So we always start out with a modest contribution to see how the partners will then use these in a way that actually impacts people. And the projects always, and this is our criteria, they have to have the poor at their core. Address the root causes of poverty, foster community solidarity, so they can't actually cause division. Sometimes when you sort of target communities, you actually cause divisions, right? You create a have and have-nots. So we definitely mitigate against that. Contribute to human sustainable development, and they have to actually bolster people's abilities and confidence, rather than react in a way where you're giving handouts, right? can be reproduced and relevant to a given reality. Finally, with that, I end with a call. Please join our community. Calgary, Carol is the Diocesan Council co-chair for Development of Peace in Calgary. So please contact her if you're interested in learning more or joining the local Calgary community. Learn the issues, give charitably, and I'm sure you do, act for justice. And of course, celebrate our 50th anniversary at a Mass on Thursday, the 19th of May at 7 p.m. at St. Mary's Cathedral. And you're welcome